Welcome to Good Sex at NYU, a podcast about sex, relationships, health, and mental health in a sex-positive space. So if you're looking for sometimes serious, sometimes funny, and always sex-positive discussions, then you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Elliman, Associate Director of Sexual and Relationship Respect Services at Counseling and Wellness Services. I use she, her pronouns.
And I am April Fellers, a nurse and sexual health educator at the Student Health Center. I also use she, her pronouns. We are two white, cisgender, heterosexual, female-identifying clinicians, one with a medical background and the other with mental health experience, who seek to create a space that is inclusive of all identities, backgrounds, and perspectives.
Today on Good Sex at NYU, we are joined by Anthony Lee, a New Jersey native and freshman at NYU with an undeclared major. Anthony is a member of Tea Party, New Mask, and an e-board member for Arrows and Aces at the LGBTQ+Center. Anthony writes fantasy novels and reads Shakespeare in their free time. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'm wondering if you would like to share your pronouns and anything else you would like listeners to know before we get started.
I think you about covered it. Pronouns are they, them, and I'm excited to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. We want the space to be equitable. And so we're going to ask some, really vulnerable questions at times, and feel free to answer any ones that you feel comfortable answering. If some feel like they're approaching some boundaries, then we will honor your boundaries. But we're also open to you turning any of those questions around on us. We want to be vulnerable in this space as well. We know coming on this podcast can be a lot. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And so we want to be there with you in that vulnerability. Really want to just start off with hopefully an easy question. Can you tell us maybe one thing that you like about being part of the NYU community?
Well, I'd say I just like having a community. It's really nice to meet so many different people, get to know them, get to experience new things that I probably would not have like in any other scenario. It's just nice to meet new people.
Because we did mention a few different things that you're part of at the LGBTQ+Center, we can touch this now or later, but I'm curious how you got involved. Like, I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of a lot of the services offered at the LGBTQ+Center. Yeah, how did you find those groups, and what do you like about it?
I'd say I actually did seek them out. My first week here, I kind of made a beeline for the LGBTQ Center. I was like, I have to find people that I know for sure I have something in common with. After that, it was just sort of a matter of attending the different meetings, finding which groups I resonated with a little more, and so that's sort of where I'm at right now. It was very, very straightforward process for me.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm glad you found that community there. Let's talk about the broader culture, kind of thinking macro, big level. Can you tell us how the broader culture has potentially influenced your personal choices in life, dating, and sex?
Well, sort of to start, I sort of fall under the aromantic umbrella, which means that the way I experience romantic attraction is sort of a little different than sort of what other people would classify as romantic attraction. I'm not strictly a romantic, which I don't experience romance at all. I do have some romantic feelings, but it's sort of up in the air. And so I feel like that's also impacted the way I view relationships, because there's so much messaging for be in a relationship, have this as your life goal. There's a lot of people talking about marriage as the thing that makes you an adult, or in media there's always people who are oh, relationships are what makes me a better person, what makes me happy. And it's very valid for some people. I definitely know some people who being in a relationship has definitely changed their life, but it sort of comes off as this is the norm and everyone has to fit this specific expectation.
Yeah, I'm really connecting with that. I think that so much pressure in our media through, romantic comedies, there's always a couple, right? And I think the messages that we receive is to be happy means we need to be in this, relationship with a partner. And I think that whether you're aromantic or asexual or even someone who is single, those aren't always, depicted in a positive light in our media. I think maybe we have a little bit more representation these days, but I know that it's definitely something that comes up for me. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. Are there other things that have impacted you on a broader cultural level?
I'd say one thing that's definitely impacted me sort of on a broader level is also how classmates and like friends also treat relationships, since I feel like, especially as a younger person, there's sort of the idea that love is more passionate and more just all around, like especially in college, there's sort of the expectation that this is when people start discovering their identity and getting into relationships. And there's all this messaging like how to have safe practice, which I am all for, and like how to navigate healthy relationships. But that also comes with the expectation that you will be having these relationships in the first place. And I feel like it puts a lot of pressure onto people to find these early on, even if they're tentative or if they're just not in the place for that.
Well, I think even just what you said, I think a lot of that is focused on romantic relationships, when it could just mean, how do you have healthy friendships? How do you have healthy relationships in the context of professional situations? It's like you need healthy relationships within your life, with family, with friends. But I think because of the broader culture, we automatically assume that we're thinking about intimate partners. So I think even that is like one of those misconceptions that it's like, oh, this is a time for college students to be making relationships, but not just intimate. Key friendships can be really important, and how to have healthy friendships is also really valid and important, but also not something that is really focused on or emphasized in the culture.
And we talked about this before, but I heard this in the original answer that you gave, that being single is either somebody wishes they were in a relationship or that they are always looking for that kind of a relationship, and that just being single and a solitary person is sufficient. Like that's not ever the message, that like it's okay that I'm single and I'm okay being single and I want to be single, or I'm not looking for a relationship. And it just seems like that's never acceptable. It's sort of like, oh, well, you're just telling yourself that you don't want a relationship. You're just telling yourself that so that you don't feel bad that nobody wants to be in a relationship with you, or, you know, whatever messaging is getting thrown at us, that you know, it just seems like being single by choice is not really celebrated or even shown in the media very, very regularly. It's almost like, even if it's a TV show about a set of girlfriends, like even like Sex and the City, like they're always out there looking for a relationship or all that, even though they go through phases of being single. So I think that is something that we could highlight better in our media and our workshops that we're working on, those kinds of things. Yeah. What kinds of media or representation, like what would that look like to you in terms of, or messaging would you wish was available outside of the healthy dating relationships, or finding, like, what other kinds of messaging do you think would you like to see?
Part of this for me is that I would like to see people being able to go about their lives, and I feel like that's just sort of the main thing when it comes to my view of representation. I feel like the best way to represent people is through them just living their lives, and so I think that just means letting people, like, in shows and movies exist and not have to give them like an obligatory love interest, or not having them to constantly be like, oh, woe is me because I'm single. Like, just have more stories where people can be focused on their career or their friendships and put a spotlight on those, and not be like, oh yeah, and then like in the end they find this one boy that they really like and that is shoved in there. Like, just let people exist in a sphere where dating is just not their priority, or just isn't even the thing that they're thinking about.
And have you seen any of that? Are there any good examples that are currently on your radar? I'd
say one example I actually really like is Lilith from the Owl House. She's been confirmed by the creator as aromantic, asexual, not interested in relationships. And I really like that because I feel like, especially with cartoons, there's sort of the idea of like, oh, and then you just obligatory pair everyone up. I like it because she gets to just be her own character, and she doesn't have, like, that show in general is just absolutely fantastic in terms of like LGBT representation in general. And so I like the way that it's not brought up as like a huge thing, like, oh my god, you don't date anyone. It's just a thing. Like, and I feel like there's a lot of there are a lot of other shows that sort of follow that similar template where characters don't address, like, they just don't address, like, they don't have any love interest, they just don't address it, they have other things. And so I like those kinds of characters.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing at least one, because I think more people need to know what are some good representations. Not everyone is as tuned in. I know me, I'd never heard of that show. I don't watch a lot of television in general, but I think that I love to learn about where there's some good representation, so I can watch the good instead of like trying to it makes me feel really overwhelmed to like go out there and like, oh, I don't want to like get invested and then see some problematic things. And so I just get overwhelmed.
I feel like for like aromantic or asexual representation, it's sort of your mileage may vary, since there's a lot of characters out there that some people are like, oh my God, this is like the pinnacle of representation. And then some people that are like, this is so problematic. What are you talking about? And then there's a third party that's like, mentioning it at all is a huge issue. It's drawing attention to the thing when like the whole point is you're not supposed to draw attention to it. And so it's a very complicated debate. Like there's one character in Steven Universe who a lot of people interpret as asexual peridot that I absolutely love, but some people are like, she's problematic because she shows signs of so and so tropes. It really just depends on what kind of message you're trying to do. To bring up a third character, Todd from BoJack Horseman has an entire arc where he realizes that he's asexual. And so I really like the way they handled that. But if you put that exact same arc into a show that features like a predominantly queer cast and is aimed at a queer audience, I feel like his arc would not be as strong because they take a lot of time to explain what this is and they go through the entire process. And some people in the community would be like, this is just really ham-fisted. So it comes down to context.
I think that's totally right. Like maybe in BoJack Horseman, they're trying to reach an audience that maybe has never heard of asexuality, and so there is more explain that needs to happen. But even within a community, everybody might feel different, right? Of like, oh yes, I'm glad that there's representation, period. This isn't good enough, you know. And I think that you can't please everybody. But
I think you sometimes need all of those voices,
right?
Because I think that you need to explain to some people. You need it to not be the main character sometimes, because we're full people, just like someone's relationship isn't all of what they are, right? And so it's like we need all of those things to push us forward and to hold us accountable for when we're not representing people in a light that makes them full and whole, right? So I think that it's great that you've mentioned several characters, right? I think that it's important to have all of those depending on the context. And again, who the target audience is also matters, right? Like if they're people who are newly discovering their identities, then maybe they do need more of the explanation versus others that maybe are deeply into their journey and don't need it and want it to be more fully developed. So I can appreciate all of those.
What about going a little smaller, some institutions, maybe thinking government, church, religion, school? How have those institutions impacted how you navigate your life and engage or don't engage in sex and relationships?
I definitely have an answer for this one. I feel like the idea of marriage being such a huge thing legally, that has definitely impacted the way I sort of view relationships. Like you get a tax break, which is for me a huge incentive to get married because like taxes. Or if you're in the ER, you can only be visited by family members, or if you're married that person, you can't just have a friend show up and say like, okay, yeah, this is the person I'm going to be with. And so I feel like there's also like a legal expectation that yes, you will get married at some point. Whereas even on the topic of relationships, I know some people who are in relationships who want to get married. I know some people who are in relationships and they're like, I don't want to get married. I just want to keep it as it is. I feel like there is also that legal pressure. Also, there's a lot of religions where it's like, oh, getting married is the next step of your life. And I feel like there's a lot, again, it's just everyone's just constantly sort of messaging that this is sort of the end goal. And it doesn't really account for non-traditional ways of having relationships.
Yeah, I will also, as someone who's not super religious, point out that I believe there's someone fairly important in the Christian faith who is single. I mean, just saying that maybe we need to like represent that. I mean, again, I'm not super religious, but just thinking about the fact that Jesus was single and they talked about how he could do more things as a single person.
That was Paul. But
well,
yeah.
Paul said, I said someone.
Yeah.
I knew it was someone. Right. And so I think somehow it became all about the religious institution of marriage. That was how two households came together, and the dowry and all of this stuff that was what we were supposed to
and multiply.
Yeah,
It was all related to reproduction and
absolutely.
Yep.
But how that isn't right for everyone. And it was very clearly not right for this particular figure in religious text, right? And where did we lose that? And I also really connect with you on the not having tax breaks, and what do we do as single people when we have a medical emergency? Who's our emergency contact? And how is that perceived in our culture and society and in those institutions? Like if I go to a hospital, how is that seen? Because I'm not married. But there's also, I think, I don't know if either of you saw this, there was a recent, I think, New York Times article about two really close friends who recently got married. They weren't in a relationship. I don't know if they identified sexual or not, but they just sort of identified themselves as best friends over the course of their life. And they decided to get married as friends.
For the benefits?
Again, I should have read the whole article. But my interpretation was that there was benefits of like the emergency contact. There was all the things that we're talking about now, because it's only really recognized, you're supposed to be romantic. You're supposed to be sexual with these partners that you marry. And even that was kind of novel, in this article.
I feel like there is also sort of the idea that your romantic relationships are elevated above all of your other relationships. I'm not saying that they aren't important. I'm saying like they are obviously important given that so many people place so much value in it, but also it sort of tends to undermine the value of a very close friend. Since even within like my own family, we do place some value in romantic relationships, but not above friendships or familial relationships. Like I would say I prioritize I'm saying this as someone who has not experienced much romantic attraction. I prioritize family over, say, a partner. And so if I get like hit by a car, then I want my family to be there first and foremost. Or like those two best friends you were talking about, people might look at that and just be like, oh, why is that not a romantic relationship? As if that is sort of just the new level you unlock once you reach a certain amount of like friendship points. Like, why can't friendship be just as special?
I think some people that are polyamorous, or we've talked about this in terms of that, and not necessarily that everybody that, or
relationship anarchy.
Yes, I was like, there's another term. Yes,
I didn't know where you were going with this. I wasn't quite sure what you were.
But yeah, that all relationships are equal, and that there isn't necessarily one relationship that's that.
But I do sometimes feel like even in that frame, our culture kind of comes in and steps in and says, well, family is more important. And again, I think that's
if you don't
great,
have a romantic partner,
or if you're single, for sure. But I think that family is the most important thing, is a thing that we hear a lot. And again, I think it is really important, but there's a lot of people that don't have great relationships with their family. And so then they have to go out there and they say, oh, well, like your family of choice. But somehow there's still this like connection where it's like, oh, but everyone goes to their blood family for holidays or for certain events. And those chosen family members don't often get the invite. Like, right, as a single person, I don't get a +1, or if I do, it's expected that it's for a romantic partner, not my best friend. Or it's just this blood family is also on this pedestal that we have to like, oh, but that's my cousin, or that's my sister. Again, not that they shouldn't be, but I think it's also those chosen folks, they end up getting brushed aside at times. And so I really appreciate the relationship anarchy where it's like, no, I think like we need to not leave our friends behind, even if we do have close relationships with family, or a crisis happens in family and so you go and you show up. But I just think it can also be really complicated when it comes to like holidays and events and stuff like that, where it's like, oh, well, I can't invite my best friend. I can't invite several of my friends to my family.
I'm curious, thinking about school, what was sex ed like for you? Was there any discussion about aromanticism or asexuality, and kind of how did you explore those topics and kind of learn about that for yourself, and what was that process like?
All right. Well, in high school, my sex ed took place over Zoom. So already that was a huge thing, and we sort of more learned about safe practice. And I feel like one thing that my school did that I actually really liked is when they talked about how to navigate a healthy relationship, they didn't limit it to just romantic relationships. They said, if you have a friendship that you think isn't going well, here's how you step in. If you notice one of your friends is doing badly with something, here's how you step in. They talked about those, and I thought that was really helpful, because I did put that emphasis on this is not the only way to have a relationship. And so I feel like they didn't so much talk about what it meant to be asexual, what it meant to be aromantic, because obviously they're educating us on the opposite. They're educating us how to handle these things safely, and as opposed to not handling them at all. And so I feel like the way I sort of learned about it was just sort of osmosis. Like after existing in the LGBTQIA plus space for a while, you're going to learn that the A stands for asexual aromantic and not ally, which I have met more than one person who thought that. It's always fun it's like a little reveal, like, oh, surprise, there's more of us.
And with that, how has your understanding of pleasure been shaped, and has it shifted and changed? Because I know a lot of sex ed classes don't really focus on pleasure as well. And I think sometimes people think of, and again, I think this is not necessarily what I think, but maybe just something that's out there, that asexual folks don't experience sexual pleasure, or don't experience, again, these are things that aren't true necessarily, but they're on a spectrum perhaps. But like, I'm just curious, like, what your journey of pleasure looks like, whether it's sexual or not, because I feel like sometimes we just narrow it down so much.
Well, I can't really speak on the asexual experience, but I can speak on the aromantic experience. And for me, it was sort of learning the separation of different attractions. For me, that was sort of what did it for me, like learning the difference between a sexual attraction versus a romantic attraction versus a platonic attraction versus like an aesthetic attraction. Like, oh, I just like the way this looks. And so that was huge for me in understanding how to define pleasure. I could find a really good lamp pleasurable. It doesn't mean I want to have sex with that lamp.
Yeah.
And has that changed for you over time as you've kind of discovered more about yourself in the world? Like, what do you think has changed, or how's that changed?
I'd say one big thing that did actually change for me is the idea that just because you have one type of relationship doesn't necessarily mean you need to collect them all. Like, you can find, like, people can take pleasure from the strangest of places, and it doesn't need to, like, you don't need to fit sort of this specific narrow idea of A and B taking place. I feel like that it seems very basic, but it was like a huge step for me to learn that something outside of a very small binary exists. One thing that I thought was interesting was sort of the idea that there are asexuals in the kink space, mostly because kink does not necessarily correlate to sex. And I feel like that was one thing that sort of helped shape the way that I view the idea of pleasure, and it's that it doesn't need to draw from the traditional A insert into B or that kind of thing. I thought that was really interesting, mostly because it focuses less on what we view as the traditional idea of A, insert tab A into slot B, and it focused more on other types of pleasure, senses and like emotions, instead of just physical, here, cut to black, that kind of thing. And so that was something that I feel like not many people think about, and I feel like I wanted to at least bring up, because I thought, like, when I first learned about it, I was like, oh my gosh, what? You can do these things without doing them. It was like so weird to me. I was like freaking out. I was like, what is going on?
A real aha moment, as like they say.
That's how I...
Yeah. Well, I think it is really important to understand and acknowledge that, because we talk about on the podcast quite often how sex has different meanings, and we will sometimes think A inserted into B, right? And I think like we need to expand that. And that's why we ask the question about pleasure instead of sex, right? Because for some, sex isn't pleasurable, or for other reasons, maybe they're not interested in, inserting A into B, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that, it is important to understand what we like about our body or what kind of pleasure we can get out of it, whether that's going for a really long run, or maybe it's drinking some hot tea when we're really cold, or what's pleasurable for us. And so I think expanding that so we're not limiting what we think of when we think about sex. Like, so for some, it could be a really good cuddle. I mean, it's cold weather right now, and all I want is like a good cuddle. And that would be, all that I need it could hold me over for a little while. So I like that you bring up the kink because it is so sensory connected oftentimes, not always, but I think a lot of that could be, really sensual and really pleasurable. So I think it's important that you brought that into the conversation. So I appreciate that.
You did remind me of one thing. It's that within the ace community, there's sort of the inside joke that aces love cake and garlic bread. And I thought that was like when you said like a warm cup of tea, like that sort of reminded me of that. And it's like, oh, where do you get pleasure from? Cake or eating good food. Like,
I love that.
Yeah. And I enjoy both of those. Yeah. Well, and I think like we talk about here, really making sure that, your broad definition includes those things too. So you're like, oh, I need some pleasure. And it's like, where do I get that from? And sometimes we have access to inserting A into B. I'm just going to keep using that. Or maybe it is a really good, less cake, more cookie, I would say. A really good cookie and a good cup of tea, and that's my pleasure for the day. So like, how do we take care of ourselves and be kind to ourselves is, sometimes the pleasure that we take in the small things.
What about any interpersonal relationships? Have there been any key interpersonal relationships that have shaped your views of sex and relationships?
Actually, two in particular, and they both happened in high school. And the first one was this was like in sophomore year of high school, and I started hanging out with this one person. I was like, oh wow, they're really cool, I want to keep hanging out with them. And so this was when I was sort of first learning about like all these different terms. This was like at the tail end of COVID, so I already had that Zoom sex ed class, and so I was like in that headspace of, okay, I'm in high school, I gotta find a relationship because that's what they do in all the high school movies. And so I was like, oh, me and this one person, do I want to date them? And so the one thing that cinched it for me is when this person actually got a boyfriend, and I was, okay, they're not on the table, but nothing about a relationship changed. My feelings did not change. And so eventually it sort of hit me, okay, I just genuinely wanted to hang out with this person as a friend. And I had sort of tricked myself into thinking that, oh, just because I want to keep being around this person, I thought that I wanted to be like in a relationship with them. And so that was sort of like a big milestone for me in realizing that just because we're hanging out with another human being doesn't necessarily mean we want to go on a brunch date. The second one for me was this one friend that I did have where at one point they said, hey, I have romantic feelings for you. Do you want to go out? And I was like, no, I just want to hang out as friends. And then after that, something just kind of shifted and we stopped hanging out, and I was kind of disappointed. And that was sort of the second milestone for me, realizing, okay, just because I'm fine with being friends with people doesn't mean you can't just switch. Like, romance is not really a switch you can just flick on and off. Like, it's something that you have to be conscious of constantly in the world. Like, who could perceive you in this way? And if it doesn't go the way you want, that's not, like, you can't just live with it. You have to full on address it.
I'm wondering where you learned some of your communication skills and some of your boundaries, because it feels like in that, like, you'd have to have some good self-awareness, but also a lot of communication happening when it comes to some of those friendships and maybe some difficult conversations at times. But I'm wondering how that was for you.
Well, I want to cite my parents on this one. They were like, don't feel pressured to be in a relationship if you don't want to. And they were like, yeah, relationships, they're all about communication. Some of it was my high school. They were good on telling us how to have like a healthy relationship, and they were big on setting proper boundaries and communication. And so it was sort of a culmination of things. And And I feel like also some of it does have to come from an internal place of going, okay, I want to say this thing, I want to do this thing, I don't want to do this thing, and being able to find the way to verbalize it. I feel like that also has to come from, it can't just come from an outside place, it also has to come from an inside place.
That's awesome. I hope that more schools are moving in that direction of teaching communication and boundaries and learning how to cultivate, right? Like, 'cause you can say that like this came internally, but also learning how to kind of cultivate that and practicing it.
So how do you define and experience intimacy outside of traditional experiences of that? I think we talked a little bit about this already because maybe traditional constructs are more romantic, but I'm wondering, like, how are you able to be vulnerable and to connect with people on an intimate level?
I'd say intimacy for me is more about being able to communicate about something I wouldn't normally say to anyone in the room. I've been able to have intimate conversations with friends about economic anxieties or political anxieties, and I'd say those were fairly intimate conversations. I wouldn't go running through Washington Square Park yelling out my political opinions. And I feel like to me, intimacy is more about trust, like being able to open up to someone, being able to feel like this person is there for me. It's more of an emotional experience.
And are there any internal messages, thinking about everything we've talked about, of like the messaging that you've gotten from the media or from government or, anything that's just kind of being thrown at you throughout life? Is there anything that you feel like you have internalized that's potentially affected your ability to foster relationships if you had wanted that, or to explore sexuality?
I feel like this one is the most prominent message. It's a lot more basic, and I feel like a lot more people are realizing what it is, but it's sort of the expectation of, oh, I'm a guy, you're a girl, we must be together. Like, I feel like that has, to me, done the most internal harm, because it's sort of impacted my ability to form friendships with people, because every time I hang out with specific people, I go, hold on, we're hanging out, and I'm like worried that, okay, this is gonna turn into like a romantic thing, or oh, they're gonna think so-and-so, or oh, this thing's gonna happen. So I feel like just even like the most basic expectation of, oh, you must be together because you hang out all the time, like that has just, I feel like that it's everywhere, and I don't think it's ever really gonna go away, but I feel like at least acknowledging it and being able to say, okay, this is what I'm being told, but this is how things actually are, I feel like that's very important.
How do you feel like, if you're in friendships with people or any kind of a relationship, not necessarily a romantic relationship, and you're thinking about these things, do you feel like other people are also thinking about it in that way? And does that create a space where you feel like you need to be clear about what this relationship is or isn't? Like, how do those internal messages impact the way that you have conversations with folks about your relationships?
I feel like I tend to frequent a lot of circles that do have a lot of LGBTQIA kind of people, so they are a lot more understanding, and some of them also all identify under like aromantic or asexual umbrellas, and so I feel like I'm a lot more comfortable having conversations with those people. And I've sort of done a bit of a sin here where I choose avoidance, where I like to settle into friendships where I know there's like just no expectation for romantic relationships. The first thing my RA told me when I got to NYU was, don't have a relationship on your floor, don't have a relationship in your class, don't have a relationship if you're in your club. If it goes poorly, you're never going to be able to go back there. You're going to have to, there's some people I know who had relationships on their floor and they started sleeping in a different room when it got bad. Like, just don't do that. And so I feel like that those are the people I've been able to form friendships with, people who are on my floor or who I like go to the same club with. And so, cause I'm like, yeah, we both know we don't want stuff to go bad. We're here to be friends first and foremost. And so that's sort of where I'm at.
Any other internal messages that have come up for you that maybe have been influenced by some of these harmful societal norms that we want to unpack?
I feel like one thing that I see getting addressed a little more often is sort of like, I feel like it's a swing in the other direction from you have to have a relationship, and it's, oh, you don't need to have a relationship, you just need to have self-confidence, and like, you need to be assured in yourself, which I say is very important. I feel like people need to focus on themselves before they focus on other people, which in terms of self-improvement, not in terms of just a me kind of world. I feel like, if that makes any sense. And I feel like one thing that I do want to say is there are some people out there who I feel like once they get to that point of self-confidence also need to be able to swing the pendulum back the other way and acknowledge when they want to be in a relationship. I did meet one or two people who were very self-assured, but also kind of trying to disguise the fact that they wanted to be in a relationship because they were like, oh yeah, no, I'm self-possessed, I don't need anyone, I'm doing things on my own. You need to also be, I'm saying you need to be able to acknowledge that when you need other people, maybe your friendships aren't doing it and you want someone to give you Valentine's Day gifts or snuggle you on the couch while eating soup, and you want that to specifically be like a romantic partner. You need to be able to, I feel like one thing is you can't have one or the other. You need to learn that the pendulum doesn't need to be stuck on either side. You can be in the middle where you have confidence in yourself, but you can also acknowledge, okay, this is the kind of relationship I want.
What does that look like for you as somebody that identifies as aromantic?
I'd say I'm a little early on in my path, so I'm still trying to figure this out for myself. And I feel like for me, I'm aware of what I want to get out of relationships, and for me, it's a matter of finding other people who also have similar like ideas of what they want out of a relationship, and it just comes down to meeting people, and which means I need to socialize. Oh my gosh.
And what do you want to get out of relationships?
I'd say first and foremost, I need someone to talk to, and I feel like I have very specific requirements, is that they need to be fine with me staring into space at a specific point in the wall and not making eye contact. That's like the biggest thing. And I feel like it just comes down to companionship. Like I want someone to be able to chill and hang out with.
Anything else?
Yeah. I feel like that's like the big thing. There are other specific things here and there, but that's a little more personal, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah, we can honor that. We're at our last question. This is one we ask everyone. What does good sex mean to you?
I feel like good sex to me is where both parties are they're aware of what they want and they're aware of what the other person wants. And I feel like that's sort of what it means to me. Like someone where both people are in agreement and are communicative and open about things.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I know we touched briefly at the top about some of your involvement in LGBTQ+Center. Can you share with us how people, if they are not already connected, can get connected either to the groups you're part of, the LGBTQ+Center in general? What does that look like?
Oh, literally just show up. Just come by. We're on Kimmel on the 6th floor, and just literally drop by, say hi, chat to people there. Most of us are pretty friendly. Some of us do get a little frosty. Some warning, we do bite if you like. Just come in and bring good vibes and just literally hang out. There's literally just a stack of postcards that on one of the desks that like list out all the clubs and I think when they meet, and like you, or just literally ask someone, be like, hey, I saw this and I thought it relates to my identity. When do they meet? They'll tell you. We'll be like, oh yeah, we meet at 5 on Wednesdays. We meet at 2 on Thursdays. Just come by. Just hang out.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the groups that you're in and what kind of activities they do, so people can know maybe a little bit more about what they might be getting into if they do decide that they want to explore a little bit more about some of the offerings there?
Well, I'd say Arrows and Aces is just a straight up hangout space. We usually have good food. We try to get something good each. We meet like bi-weekly, so like every other week, and I'd say New Mask is more about like exploring like relationships to masculinity, and you don't necessarily need to identify with masculinity in order to hang out. Like there's a couple of cis women that hang out, a couple of non-binary folks. Like it's more about exploring like our relationship and like our societal relationship to the like preconceived ideas of manhood. It's just a fun hangout space. One week we made flower arrangements, which was so nice. And Tea Party is just come chill, talk. We had a post-election cool-down space, which was very nice. And everyone there is very supportive.
That's great. I'm really curious about the New Mask because I think that one of the things that we talk about here in this space is unpacking some of those things in which we carry with us. I mean, similar to when we talk about the question about internalized messages, how, masculinity impacts all of us, not just those people who are identifying as masculine, right? And how we have these preconceived notions around whether or not I'm presenting as masculine, or how masculine can I be, or how harmful is that masculinity that's showing up in that person. So I think it's really important that those conversations exist at NYU. So thanks for calling attention to just a couple of the, I'm sure there's so many other groups. Countless.
There's so many. There's one for graduates. There's one for more female presenting people. There's one for bisexual specifically. There's one for people of color who identify as LGBTQ. There's everyone. We got everyone.
Yeah. And I think that's important. So you can go really more general, but then also more specific because it's different for different communities. And so it's important to address all of those things. But we appreciate so much you coming here and being vulnerable in
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
If you have questions about the podcast or anything we talked about today, please feel free to reach out to us at goodsex.podcast@nyu.edu. This email address is monitored during business hours and may take 3 to 4 days for follow-up. We are definitely open to critical and thoughtful feedback, as we didn't cover everything in this episode and might have said something that was inaccurate or that had a negative impact on someone. If you have questions about your sexual health and are an NYU student, you can connect with our Student Health Center sex expert at sexpert@nyu.edu or schedule an appointment through the Student Health Center portal. Look at our show notes for additional information and resources, including organizations, articles, books, and videos.
If you have urgent mental health concerns, safety issues, or you are worried that someone might have caused harm to you, or that you might have caused harm to someone, then you can contact NYU's Confidential Wellness Exchange at 212-443-9999. Chat with them using their mobile app or email them at wellness.exchange@nyu.edu. For anyone, NYU or non-NYU listeners, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, or the National Mental Health Hotline. Simply dial 988 from anywhere in the U.S.
Thanks for listening, and tune in to our next episode where we continue to talk about good sex at NYU. Subscribe to the podcast to hear all of our quickies and interviews with NYU community members. Thanks to our content contributors for this episode, Bernadette Kerr, Alyssa LaFosse, Dr. Dominic Vaini-Amisa, Zoe Raguzios, and to our health promotion team, Anna Genova, Jenny Mellum, Parade Stone, and Arna Dixit, and to Gotham Studios and Karen Ortman.